Good evening, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer, and I hope you're doing very well tonight. Got another spoiler for you. This one is Abundant Harvest, and to be clear, it is not, I repeat, not a Strixhaven card. This is an MH2 card, so will thus not be legal when Strixhaven comes out. It will be legal when MH2 comes out in a few months, right? Just so we're all on the same page, but gotta strike while the iron is hot, right? So let's talk about it now. What does Abundant Harvest do, and will it rock? So, for 1 green mana, you get a sorcery. The text is choose land or non-land. Reveal cards from the top of your library till you reveal a card of the chosen kind. Put that card into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So, just like other modern cantrips, which we'll compare this to in some detail, for 1 mana, you get 1 card, and there's some selection involved. That's pretty much all there is to it in terms of a broad category of cantrip. It does fit the bill, but this one is pretty unique in 2 different ways. Number 1, it is green. Gotta acknowledge that it's green, that's a big deal. Of course, blue is classically the cantripping color, but more and more other colors, notoriously green with Once Upon a Time, have been eating into blue's share in the past couple years of design, as far as hegemony of cantripping goes. The other thing to note is that this guarantees you a land, if you need a land, absolutely guarantees it. And vice versa, if you're flooded, it absolutely guarantees you some kind of non-land card. Now, obviously, that's a wide variety of things. Maybe an average deck has 40 non-land cards in it or something right around there. You're definitely not going to get exactly what you need all of the time, but what you can guarantee is you're getting the right half of the mana versus spells divide, basically. Whatever it is you lack, Abundant Harvest can find it. You can keep 1-landers on the back of Abundant Harvest, and you can also probably keep higher land counts hands on the back of Abundant Harvest. So that, my friends, is very, very unique insofar as Abundant Harvest and cantrips in general are concerned. Abundant Harvest is a unique one. That, coupled with the fact that it's green, means we need to talk about it. We are talking about, will it rock, of course, will it see play in green-black rock, or perhaps other BGX mid-range archetypes in Modern, and these decks notoriously lack card selection. So, will it rock? Let's dive right in. So the first thing to do here, of course, is to compare it to other green cantrips, none of which see play in BGX, and none of which see much play in Modern either. There is Adventurous Impulse. Look at the top 3, reveal creature or land, so you do get a little bit of selection. The thing with Abundant Harvest is you only get exactly whatever the closest one to the top of your deck is of the category you choose. So let's say you would want to name land with Abundant Harvest. You could, in theory, Adventurous Impulse, see the top 3, and then see 2 different lands, and choose the best one from among them, right? The same is true for creature, although Abundant Harvest, of course, can get you non-creature. So neither is strictly better than the other, but Adventurous Impulse in some cases will be basically a better Abundant Harvest, right? Again, if you happen to be seeing the types you would have named with Harvest, and there's multiples, you get to choose the best one. The big difference, though, is Harvest is a guarantee. You keep a 1-lander with Adventurous Impulse and you cast it on T1, you don't see a land right away, well, you filtered away some draws and you're closer to finding a land, but Harvest will guarantee you that land, leaving you with no fail rate in that regard, and also allowing you to plan your turns out a little bit better. If you're like, well, if I hit a second land, I'll do this, Abundant Harvest says you will hit your second land, and then you can choose to maybe double spell with discard and Fatal Push, or you can guarantee a 2-drop, play the Bob to find more lands, and as the case may be. So the other cards are similar. We have the Commune cycle. Commune with Nature looks at the top 5, but only selects for creatures, right? This is definitely a little bit too narrow for the rock. We also have Commune with the Gods, creature, or enchantment. It's part of the Commune cycle, so I include it, even though it costs 2. And then the slightly goofy Commune with dinosaurs, right? Same deal, dinosaur land. Yeah, not very helpful to us, but just to illustrate the point, maybe the most compelling alternative would be Oath of Nissa, which again, we don't really play, but Oath of Nissa, you're going to see 3 just like Adventurous Impulse, but it can be creature, land, or planeswalker. On top of that, you can fix your mana should you need to a little bit to cast Planeswalkers. If you got one too many Fields of Ruin, maybe you can still cast a double black Liliana, stuff like that. Finally, if Oath of Nissa does go to the graveyard, it can be more likely to grow the Goyf than these sorceries. So if Oath of Nissa doesn't see play, despite being the best green mana cantrip and despite having all of these upsides, is Abundant Harvest really any good? Well, I don't know. That should actually give us some pause, to be honest. I was a little bit higher on Abundant Harvest until I started directly comparing it to these, especially to Oath of Nissa, which is the biggest competitor. Oath has several upsides that Harvest does not have, but the one gigantic upside that Harvest has is, again, that guarantee. And also, in a deck that plays a fair amount of instants and sorceries and sometimes artifacts and enchantments as hate pieces post-side, Abundant Harvest, of course, can dig toward those as well. Oath of Nissa, never gonna find you any of that stuff. So while there are pros and cons to each of these, I do think Abundant Harvest is probably the strongest green cantrip, that we currently have access to, and it's probably not even particularly close, but again, Oath of Nissa does merit a little bit of love here. Now let's compare Harvest to the cantrips that do see widespread play, and not that we could play these in a rock anyway, but it is worth comparing because, the card's gotta have a certain raw power level before it can justifiably carve out a modern niche. So first let's compare it to Serum Visions because they are both sorcery speed. So Serum is going to draw you a blind card, whereas Abundant Harvest, again, is guaranteed to give you whichever category of land or non-land that you need. That is huge. That is very, very significant. Serum Visions, however, is going to set up subsequent draws with Scry 2, and with Abundant Harvest, after you resolve it, you are kind of on your own. Nevertheless, I have seen control players and combo players alike, and I've even been one of them when I was on Ad Nauseam a time or two. You really need a land with Serum Visions, or you really need a non-land with Serum Visions, and the wrong half of those two categories is just stacked on the top, and you get a lot of value out of scrying 2 cards to the bottom, but it's still not guaranteed to get you there. And Opt is basically a worse Serum Visions, except for a very important note that it is instant speed. Now, I actually like that Abundant Harvest is not, and that is a way in which it fits better into mid-range decks, which do operate more at sorcery speed anyway, playing a lot of non-flash creatures, playing a lot of discard spells, even playing a good amount of sorcery speed removal, planeswalkers, all the rest. Opt, of course, perfect for a permission deck, perfect for a deck that wants to hold up effects, hold up flash creatures in the case of Ice Fang Quattle. You know how this works. So Abundant Harvest cannot really compete with Opt. Opt sees play because it is instant speed and something proactive to do should that player not need to use any of their reactive spells at the end of the opponent's turn. Also worth noting that Preordain is banned. We live in a world where Preordain is banned. Now, some might say that is unjust. I'm not really here to talk about that, but it is worth pointing out just how powerful cantrips can be. If something like Preordain, something as innocuous, is still deemed powerful enough to be banned, that, on the other hand, should make us look really closely at Abundant Harvest, right? Because again, there's all these competitors, they don't see any play. But then there are other competitors that see a ton of play, and there are further competitors that are very, very similar to the legal cards that are deemed too powerful to see play. A very, very slight alteration on the text, and that is about that. An Abundant Harvest, again, does not represent a slight variation on anything. It represents a guarantee, a hard guarantee. Very, very interesting, and perhaps a card that we'll just have to play with before we figure out exactly how strong it is. And finally, a comparison with the black cantrips, the little-known black or black-based deck cantrips, and we have Cling to Dust and even Cremate. So Cling to Dust is a more powerful card than Cremate overall because it has X for 1 potential, but specifically in the Uro meta, I also dabbled with Cremate as a way to answer Uro at parity. I'm drawing a card just like they are, right? And I'm dealing with Uro before he can escape. And also, Although they get to accelerate with land drops, I spend less mana on my interaction, so Cremate definitely a spicy little one, Cling to Dust probably more like what we'd be playing now, and then Mishra's Bauble is also a cantrip that sees a lot of play in Lurrus decks, whether it be Cat Rock or Shadow decks or what have you. And by the way, when we're considering Abundant Harvest for mid-range, we can also consider it, maybe even more so, for mid-range adjacent decks like Jund and 4-Color Shadow, who do play lower land counts, right? So arguably hitting that land drop off of Abundant Harvest, not having to mulligan, even more important for decks like that. You could also say that for Lurrus companion decks, or even Lurrus main deck decks, Mishra's Bauble going to reduce the land count, thereby proportionately raising the value of Abundant Harvest. But the point is, I personally, as a deck builder, have gone out of my way to include things like Cling to Dust and even Cremate, and I also feel way better when I have Mishra's Bauble in my decks, not just because Lurrus is powerful, and not just because cards like Cling to Dust are powerful, although they are, but because they smooth out those early turns. The big downfall of mid-range is being totally at the mercy of your own variants or your own keeps that you hope pay off, or if you're more disciplined with your mulligans, you're at the mercy of how often you have to mulligan, and having to work with fewer resources with a fair deck is always a very bad thing. Cling to Dust, lesser extent Cremate, and to a greater extent Mishra's Bauble, these cards have been all-stars for me across the black-based mid-range spectrum, and I think it is as much about them smoothing out the early turns as it is about anything else, enabling you to curve out 1, 2, 3. We're one of the rare decks that really wants to do that still, or indeed to double spell, if you have the spells and if you have the need and the luxury to do so. Either way, making those land drops early, or alternatively fixing your flood early to mid, is very important. It's a huge attraction to these types of cards, and I think it could be a huge attraction to Abundant Harvest as well. So a mechanical note on Abundant Harvest, you do not technically draw off of it, you put that card into your hand, as the card says, and therefore you are not hosed by Narset, Parter of Veils, or other ways to hate out draws. And not that Narset is terrorizing Modern or anything, but these things do come up, and a sorcery speed true cantrip that says draw a card is totally hosed by her. Abundant Harvest is not. Realizing that made me think of Dark Confidant naturally. Dark Confidant also puts that card into your hand. So we have thematic synergy, we have Mega Rock energy with Bob reaping the Abundant Harvest. Both effects, of course, beating Narset, but more importantly, it made me start thinking about Bob. An Abundant Harvest is just basically another piece of action that actually works well with Bob just because it costs 1. It's just another relatively painless flip off of Bob. You can even set up a turn where you Abundant Harvest into a high curve card, get that into your hand. If you're flooded, play it now, or play it next turn if it's still early to mid-game. Either way, you're not taking a massive hit off of it with Bob, but it still goes into your hand. These things will happen. I think the synergies are definitely there. Of course, Abundant Harvest rewarding you, just like Bob does for simply curving out and being efficient early. Bob can take over the game. Hex Drinker is another card that came to mind when we're thinking about how Abundant Harvest fits in with all of this, because Rock is a deck that already wants to make green mana on turn 1 a good amount of the time just to deploy Hex Drinker, just to play that Savannah Lines if you don't have a discard spell, get the clock going, get something proactive to do, and Abundant Harvest is good in that regard. We're already accommodating green on T1, and also because you don't necessarily have as many feel-bad moments with Abundant Harvest where you're like, okay, I got a good card selection spell, but it kind of cramped my style for the rest of my turn. I only got to single spell because Rock plays so many mana sinks, I don't think that would change. If you resolve an Abundant Harvest mid-game, you've got a Hex Drinker, a Scavenging Ooze, or other Rock mana sinks down, you can still have a maximally efficient turn. Now we've been talking about Rock, well what about Jund? Well, let's be clear, if Abundant Harvest proves to be more powerful than I'm thinking right now and than most people are thinking right now, by the way, opinion on this card is really split right out of the gates, but if this blows everybody's expectations out of the water, everybody can and will play it, probably including Jund. If Rock's going to play it and it's super powerful, Jund's going to play it too. But let's say for the sake of argument it's kind of borderline, it's kind of like maybe we could play it, maybe not. It's going to be a better fit in Rock for all of the reasons I just mentioned and then these. If you look at the Jund land base, Stomping Ground represents this. They're going to have to fetch Stomping Ground sometimes on T1 or Overgrown Tomb. Might not be optimal for them, might be more painful than necessary for them, but they're going to want to do it just to cast this card, right? And it's just not as much of a free roll as it is in Rock, both in terms of the pain and in terms of the green mana production. You also have this being a relatively underwhelming hit off of Bloodbraid Elf. It's still live, it's still not bad, it's still setting you up for some decent value. It's still a 2-for-1 with some selection involved, but with Bloodbraid Elf, you're really trying to turn the corner quickly and cheat out as powerful of a spell off of Cascade as you can. For that reason, Jund's curve skews a little bit higher than Rock's, and I think Abundant Harvest could really further bifurcate the two decks, with Abundant Harvest wanting Rock to stay really low curve and Jund being less interested in it. I don't have Renin 6 pictured here, although maybe I also should. It's just less likely, I guess, that you need to name land with Abundant Harvest on Jund, because you have Renin 6, assuming you've made 2 land drops and they can make RG. Finally, Seasoned Pyromancer is a form of card selection. Jund plays more card selection incidentally than Rock, so for all of these reasons, I think Abundant Harvest better fit in Rock than in Jund. You could also finally maybe say that slots are a little more freewheeling, a little less tight, as things stand in good old Rock. Now let's be clear, whenever there's a card that's potentially fair deck playable these days, it is liable to be more abused by linear decks, by extreme decks, even dare I say by jank decks. Abundant Harvest does seem to me, as somebody who's never played the deck, like it could be a good fit in Amulet Titan. I don't expect that it will see play in Tron. I think Ancient Stirrings is exactly where Tron wants to be. I didn't mention Ancient Stirrings in the green cantrips, by the way, because it's even less playable, even more restricted for mid-range purposes than the other ones, but it is the most powerful, of course, green cantrip that exists in the format. And let's remember again that people were calling for Stirrings to be banned for a while. Too much consistency. Just another reason we should not ignore Abundant Harvest. But yeah, this could power up Amulet Titan, I don't know, but definitely wouldn't surprise me. I also have Treasure Hunt and Zombie Infestation. This could definitely power up some jank decks that naming a land or non-land is really powerful for their consistency. With Zombie Hunt or any number of other ones, who knows? That's not my forte. Just want to mention it for the sake of completion. So to summarize, my friends, I think Abundant Harvest is extremely potentially powerful by virtue of its consistency. It is consistent in a way that no other cantrip is. Now, it doesn't mean it has the same strengths and upsides as other cantrips. It's not strictly better than any cantrip we covered, even the ones that don't see any play. However, it is more consistent. You could argue that it has the highest floor of any cantrip, and it is unique. It's also green, so with all those things in mind, it is irresponsible to ignore it or dismiss it. We absolutely have to think about it. We absolutely have to test it. It might prove to be very powerful, and I think if it rocks, if it fits into BGX in general, the Rock will be its best home, and it will further incentivize us toward lower curve builds, but ones that retain mana sinks. And with that, we do also have Lurrus in mind. Lurrus also already provides very strong incentives to keep the curves low. Abundant Harvest alongside cards like Hexdrinker and Dark Confidant really hammers that home. So these are my initial thoughts on the brand new green cantrip coming out in Modern Horizons 2. Thank you so much for watching. Obviously, I want you guys to let me know what you think below, and I'll talk to you there. Thanks again, and I'll see you for more spoilers and more gameplay to come.